Hey, good morning. Morning. Like my wife said, my name is Steven, and I am one of the pastors on staff around here, and it is just a privilege to be the guy with the headset on this morning, opening Scripture to see what it might have to say to us. And so with that being said, if you've got your Bibles on hand this morning, would you open up with me to the book of John, chapter 21? That's where we are going to be camping out today in this, our third installment of our four-part series through the conclusion of the book of John that we're calling Do You Love Me? And as fate would have it, today is the day that we are slated to unpack the part of the story that is the namesake of this sermon series. It's the part of the story where Jesus asks one of his disciples specifically, do you love me? And so I feel like I'm like singing the title track of an album or something like that. If you remember musical albums back in ancient, like 2015, when people used to write songs and record them and release them as a collective, it was a whole thing. Spotify ruined it, but maybe it'll come back someday. Things tend to circle back. Anyway, so we are, this is the second to last week of this sermon series, which means that it is the second to last week of our journey through the book of John, which is just crazy, because I feel like we've never not been in the book of John, which is basically true. We've basically been going through the book of John for as long as we've been at church. For the last 3 years, we've just been systematically going through this gospel account of Jesus' life, verse by verse, and it's been just an incredible journey. I hope that it's been meaningful for you, for however long you've been a part of it. I know that it has for me. It's a little bittersweet that we're coming to the end of it, but fear not, there is life beyond the book of John, and there is more Bible to be studied, I promise. We've got some cool things planned for the rest of the year, but for today, we'll be in John chapter 21. I'm going to go ahead and pray for our time, and we'll get rolling. Would you pray with me? Jesus, thank you for moments like this, God, where we can get together in your presence, where you promise to meet us. And so, Lord, we pray that this morning, God, as I preach, God, as we read your word, as we learn from who you are, God, I pray that you would reveal yourself to us. God, I pray that you would give us practical ways to live out our life following you better. God, we love you. Pray that you would just meet us in this time, and thank you that you always do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So I've worked in ministry for the majority of my adult life, on and off in various capacities, and as a result, I have gotten into some interesting conversations over the years, and it's often in like a small talk context, right? Because there's always that lull in a small talk conversation, right, where people don't really know what to say next, and the conversation is starting to kind of wane, and so they just default to asking you what you do for a living, right? And it's polite, but it's ultimately meaningless because most people don't actually care what you do for a living. They're just so afraid of silence or so afraid of the conversation dying off that they just kind of like default mindlessly to this question that most people have an answer to, right? It's kind of like when I was in college, and the first couple weeks that I was a freshman on campus, they had all of these social events for us to go to meet other people who were also new and to make friends, and it was just, they were always super awkward because it was just small talk central, and nobody actually made friends at these things, but inevitably, like the second question out of everybody's mouth was, what's your major, right? Which was dumb because at my school, we couldn't even declare majors for 2 years, you know, and most people change their majors multiple times. But it's just funny how we just default to these kind of template questions when we're in small talk conversations that we're feeling awkward in. And so now that I'm an adult, I get asked what I do for a living quite a bit. And my answer tends to catch people off guard because for many years, like I said, I have answered that I work in a church to varying capacities. And that's often a weird thing for people who don't understand that there are more people than just like priests in robes or like old bookkeepers that do what I do, right? And so my answer tends to inspire like a whole range of responses, ranging from like that being the immediate end of the conversation because people feel uncomfortable or they feel like they have some sort of resentment towards the church and they don't want to have anything to do with anybody that's associated with it, all the way to like the other end where people make really awkward attempts to relate. And those tend to actually be some of the most interesting ones for me. A couple of years ago, I was in a grocery store, and over the course of checking out, the cashier, as she's scanning my items, asked me what I do for work, and I tell her, and her face just immediately lights up, and she goes, oh, I used to be a part of Young Life. And I was like, oh, that's awesome, like, I love Young Life. And then she didn't say another word for like the next 2 minutes, didn't even make eye contact until she told me my total and handed me my receipt. It was weird. My wife and I also used to live across from this guy. He was a super cool guy, really helpful, always down to pitch in whenever we needed something. We would always have great conversations. And one time it came up that her and I both work in a church, and this guy that we had never really had an awkward interaction with before, just starts to like fumble his words all over the place. And he goes, "Oh man, I grew up in the church. Churches are great. Yeah, I good times. I mean, I should really get back someday." And I was like, okay. It's fascinating how often I run into people who, when they find out what I do for work, or when they just find out that I'm a Christian, right, their initial response is to make some attempt to relate, right? They're like, "Oh, that used to be me too," right? But then it's fascinating how this underlying sense of shame begins to become evident, right? This shame that they carry around about the fact that something happened at some point that caused them to drift away from this thing that they once felt so committed to, right? And you can just see it on their face. There's sadness, and there's grief, and there's a sense of loss, and it's awkward, and they don't really know what to say, and often I don't know what to say, right? And I have a hunch that for many of us in the room, if we're being honest, for one reason or another, we can at least relate on some level, right? Like, yes, you're in the room, so it's a little bit different. But for many of us, I think that we can relate to the sense that maybe at one point in our lives, we felt like we were more committed to the things of Jesus than we are now. Like at one point in our lives, we were more passionate about his mission and doing the things that he says than we are now, right? Maybe it was in high school, or maybe it was in college, or maybe it was the years when we were an early Christian, or whatever it is. But I think that many of us can look back and realize that there was a point in our lives when we were a lot more excited and cared a lot more about the things of Jesus and doing what he says than we do now. And so, yeah, we're here, and that's good. But in a lot of ways, this might be sometimes an exercise in going through the motions than it is an exercise in actual discipleship. Right? And so we can kind of relate to that sense of apathy or exhaustion towards the things that used to give us so much life, but that maybe don't so much anymore. And if we take a really honest inventory of our past, I think that many of us can probably point to an experience or a collection of experiences as to the reason why. That at some point, something happened. Maybe it was something that we did, or something that happened to us, or it was just some kind of a slow fade that disrupted that sense of enthusiasm and passion and commitment that we once had for doing the things of Jesus, right? And there can be a lot of shame in that, and there can be a lot of feelings of defeat in that, and I get that. We're about to read a story this morning about a disciple named Peter who lived that story, right? Who at one point in his life was very self-assuredly committed to the things of Jesus, and he was very enthusiastic about his discipleship, right? He cared a lot. He even claimed to have an unbreakable allegiance to the things of Jesus. But then something happened, right? Something happened, came into his life that caused all of that enthusiasm, all of that passion, all of that care, all of that commitment to dissolve in an instant, right? In a moment of truth, when faced with the decision between associating himself with Jesus and distancing himself from Jesus, he chose the latter. And just like Jesus predicted that he would, he denied him. He denied knowing him 3 times over. And so what we have to understand as we approach this text this morning is that Peter brings a lot of shame to this part of the story that we're about to read. And like many of us, right, his present moment, he brings to it an awareness of the brutal contrast between the disciple that he used to be, right, the disciple that he started out as, the disciple that he ideally wanted to be, and the disciple that he ultimately became. But there's a whole lot of also good news for Peter in this story, which means there's a lot of good news for us as well, because we learn a lot about Jesus through this passage. What we learn about Jesus and the nature of his grace is that nothing that we do, no failure of ours puts us beyond the reaches of his mercy. Nothing disqualifies us from his forgiveness. Nothing disqualifies us from his love. Instead, Jesus actually repurposes our failure and uses it to help us to live out a better story, not one that's defined by our past, but one that's actually defined by him and by who he says that we are. And that's really good news and something worth taking a lot of solace in this morning. So like I said, we're going to pick the story up today in John chapter 21. At this point in the story, Jesus and his disciples have just finished eating breakfast. They're sitting there on the shore of the Sea of Galilee after Jesus had just mysteriously showed up on the beach and started heckling the disciples about being terrible fishermen, telling them to throw their nets to the other side of the boat, after which they caught a whole bunch of fish and realized that it was Jesus, and Peter jumped in, swam to shore. It was a whole thing. And now, so they've just finished having breakfast, and that's where we'll pick the story up today. In verse 15, it says this: When they had eaten breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him. "You know that I love you." "Feed my lambs," he told him. It's interesting here that Jesus chooses to address Peter not as Peter, right, but as Simon, son of John. Because Simon if you know the story, was Peter's birth name. But also, if you know the story, you know that Jesus at one point renamed him, right? He gave him the name Peter when he declared that Peter would be the rock upon which Jesus would build his church. And the name Peter, which is the English derivative of the Greek name Petros, literally means rock. And so it's meant to say something about Jesus' intention for Peter. It's meant to say something about Peter's identity and his destiny in light of who Jesus had called him to be. Right? Because the name Simon, Peter's given name, his birth name, is a Hebrew name meaning reed, like tall, wavy grass, right? And so when Jesus renamed Peter, he was in effect speaking a new identity and a new destiny over Peter, essentially communicating to him that, Peter, you're no longer going to be, like a reed blown about by forces around you. You are going to actually be a steadfast, immovable rock upon which I'm going to build my movement. Like, I'm giving you a new calling, and your name reflects that. And so what's interesting about Jesus' use of Simon here instead of Peter, at least many scholars would suggest, is that Jesus is intentionally using it as a subtle reminder of the fact that Peter didn't live up to his calling, right? He didn't live up to who Jesus had called him to be, but instead had reverted back to his former ways, to his former identity. And so Jesus' initial question of Peter here when he says, "Do you love me?" when he addresses him as Simon, son of John, right? It's designed to get at Peter to the depth of his being and to expose the core of who he was, to cause Peter to begin to reckon with the reality of his own shortcomings as the starting point of his process of redemption. Because Jesus knows that whatever future potential Peter has for kingdom effectiveness, whatever future potential Peter has for ministry, depends entirely upon Peter's ability to reckon with his failures and his willingness to allow Jesus to begin the process of making whole what had been broken. Otherwise, Peter would just be bound to a life and a ministry bound by the shame that had been bred into his life, and he would never live fully and freely into who God had called him to be. And so Jesus, in referring to Peter by his former name, is reminding him that he ran from his calling, but that he has something other for him. Another interesting thing here is that Jesus asked Peter if he loves him more than these, right? Which is an interesting question because it begs the question, who are these? It's kind of vague, right? Scholars are a bit divided on exactly what Jesus is asking Peter to compare his love to. Some suggest that he might be asking Peter to compare his love for Jesus to like fishing or the boats or this old way of life that he had returned to. Other scholars speculate that Jesus could be asking Peter to compare Peter's love for Jesus to Peter's love for his friends. Like, do you love me more than you love your friends? But probably the most compelling academic opinion on it, and the one that I think makes the most sense in the broader context of Peter's life, and probably the one that has the most scholarly consensus around it, is that Jesus was actually asking Peter, like, do you think that you love me more than the other disciples love me? Peter, do you think that you love me more than your friends do? Do you think that your love for me is superior to that of everyone else's? And the reason I think that this one makes the most sense is because if you know the story, remember that before Peter went on to deny Jesus 3 times, Peter was actually the one who had the self-confidence enough, the ego enough, to claim that he did, in fact, love Jesus more than everybody else. We see this play out in Matthew 26, verses 31 to 33. It says this, "Then Jesus said to them, 'Tonight all of you will fall away because of me. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee.' Peter told him, 'Even if everyone falls away because of you, I will never fall away.'" Right? Essentially saying, Jesus, I'm Peter, right? I'm the rock. I'm the steadfast, immovable one. Like, I'm the one that you're building your church on. Even if what you're saying is true, even if all of these chumps do abandon you, like, I will not. I'm sticking this out to the end. You can reliably count on me. I will never fall away. My love for you is superior to that of theirs. My commitment is better than theirs, right? And then, of course, comes this moment in John chapter 13, beginning in verse 36. "Lord," Simon Peter said to him, "where are you going?" Jesus answered, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me, but you will follow me later." "Lord," Peter asked, "why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you." Jesus replied, "Will you lay down your life for me? Truly I tell you, a rooster will not crow until you have denied me 3 times." Right? And then, of course, Peter goes on to do exactly that, right? In John chapter 18, after having already denied Jesus twice, the story goes on to say this. "One of the high priest's servants, A relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off said, "Didn't I see you with him in the garden?" And this is the third time this happens, just like Jesus said. Peter denied it again, and immediately a rooster crowed. So see, it was always Peter publicly declaring his unconditional devotion to Jesus, but then it was Peter, in one of the most tragic ironies of all time, who had one of the most public and well-documented failures of devotion that we read in the Bible. Right? Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Jesus is trying to get at Peter's pride by asking him to examine his heart and to determine whether Peter still believes that his love is superior to that of everyone else's. And what's Peter's response to Jesus' question? It's interesting. He says, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And what a fascinating response. Because this shows that this is not the same Peter who boldly claimed that he would never fall away, right? This isn't the same Peter who claimed that he would be willing to die for Jesus. This is not the same Peter that we saw cutting a dude's ear off in the Garden of Gethsemane, ready to go to war for his Messiah, right? This is not the same Peter we used to read about. No, this is a Peter who has been broken, who's been humbled, who has experienced the limits of how far his ego could take him, and now understands that he has a need to rely on something other than himself. And so what's interesting in his response here is that rather than appealing to his own strength like he maybe would have before, rather than making an arrogant case for his own commitment to Jesus like he maybe would have before, he simply appeals humbly to Jesus' knowledge of his heart. Right? He doesn't say, "Yes, Lord, I love you, and here's all the reasons why, and here's all of the things that I'll do over time to verify it." Right? No, he just simply says, "Lord, you know that I do." And so whatever self-confidence Peter used to carry around is now gone. Whatever front that he used to put up to hide behind, to shield himself from, it's gone, right? And so rather than boasting in his love for Jesus and trying to over-represent the reality of it like he would have before, he basically just says, "Jesus, you know that I love you. You know my heart. There's no longer any pretense or veneer or disguise left for me to hide behind, right? I've simply squared with the reality of my shortcomings. Everything that I used to put up as a front, all of that credibility was ruined the night that I denied you, and all I can do is appeal to the fact that you know everything and you know that I love you," right? All that I can do is simply offer you my heart because I have nothing else. Friends, the process of redemption begins where pride ends. That's real. Right? I think that so often we're super quick to forget that we literally have nothing to offer Jesus that he hasn't already offered us. Right? Yet we behave as though somehow Jesus is just supplemental to our spiritual process rather than entirely comprehensive for it. Like, yes, he's helpful, but only insofar as I do certain things or I become certain things, right? He's only helpful if, like, as a supplement to my spiritual process. But the reality is that there is nothing that we bring to the table that he hasn't already brought in both superior quantity and in superior quality. And so any attempt for us to conjure up solutions to our problems or to strive for healing to our brokenness apart from complete reliance on Jesus will ultimately fall short because we're finite beings trying to deal with the infinite problems of our souls. And so if Peter's heart posture is at all instructive for us today, it's that in order for us to deal with the problems of our past that are crippling our present, that are affecting our present ability to live as disciples, we have to simply bring nothing, like full stop. We have to come empty. We have to have the humility to recognize that the only answer to the problems that we have, the only answer to the problems of our past that are breeding brokenness into our present, is to allow Jesus to do the work that only he can do, right? The process of redemption is only going to begin where our pride ends and our humility starts. It's imperative. The interaction between Peter and Jesus continues in verse 16. A second time he asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Lord," he said to him, "you know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep," he told him. He asked him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was grieved that he asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep," Jesus said. You know, reading this part of the story, I used to wonder, like, is Jesus being mean here? Is he just trying to bully Peter or like rub Peter's face in it or vindictively shame Peter in front of his friends? You know, like, "Do you love me, Peter?" "Yes, Lord." "Oh, really? Because it didn't seem like that a few days ago. Remember that whole part where you said you didn't know me? Let's run it again, Peter. Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord, you know I do." "Oh, really, Peter? Because it feels like we've been down this road before. It feels like you've sung this tune before. It feels like I've heard this before. Do you love me, Peter?" Right? I used to read it like that because I used to imagine God like that. I used to imagine Jesus being really high on shame and being really low on grace and never really being all that satisfied with my attempts to articulate my love for him. But that's not the Jesus of the Bible. That's not the Jesus of the Bible. And you know how I know? Because that is absolutely not the Jesus that we run into in this passage, right? Jesus isn't trying to shame Peter for his past. Jesus isn't trying to appear skeptical about Jesus or about Peter's commitment to him, right? He's just giving Peter an opportunity to rewrite the story. Right? If Jesus was trying to club Peter with his past and shame him for it, Jesus would keep looking back, wouldn't he? He'd keep looking back. But what does he do? He looks forward. He looks forward, right? Do you love me, Peter? I do, Lord. I know you do. Feed my lambs. Do you love me, Peter? I do, Lord. I know you do. Shepherd my sheep, right? Do you love me, Peter? I know you do. And let's go. Let's move on, right? Let's not dwell on what can't be undone, but let's dwell on what I have done. And what I have done is final, right? I have died for every failure. I have died for every shortcoming. I have died to give you the freedom to not be defined by who you were or what you did, but to be defined by who I am and by what I did and by who I say you are. And you want to know who I say you are? Look at the cross, buddy, right? Peter, I know you love me. So feed my lambs, shepherd my sheep, do the work of the ministry I've called you to, live into your God-given destiny, live up to your identity in me. Don't get so wrapped up in your past that you fail to see what I have for you. Friends, the world is full of sheep. It's full of sheep. And you know what sheep need? A lot of help. A lot of help. They are very, very helpless animals. They're basically nature's victim, right? Did you know that sheep will die of thirst inches from a flowing stream because they're so afraid of running water? That's crazy, right? They're helpless. And so it's no accident, I don't think, that Jesus refers to people as sheep. I don't. Because in a spiritual sense, I think that there are a lot of people out there who would rather die of spiritual thirst than drink from the flowing stream right in front of them, right? And so they need people called by God, people like you and I, to be their shepherds, to lead them to the still water of God's grace, where they will find the water of life, right, the salvation of their souls and the eternal quenching of their thirst. But the reality is they're not going to get there on their own because they're sheep. And I think, right, and I think far too often, the church is just a sadly ineffective force for evangelism and mission in the world, not because we don't have a vision for it, but because our churches are just full of people who are so bogged down in their past and whose discipleship is so stunted by things that may have happened before that they aren't able to live into their full potential as the shepherds that Jesus called them to be. Right? Our churches are just filled with potential shepherds who could be out there shepherding people to the still waters of the gospel, right? But they're so stuck in shame and brokenness and in apathy, and they're looking back instead of forward. Right? But Jesus doesn't come to you and say, "Do you love me?" Then what the heck was that? Right? It's not his disposition. Jesus comes and says, "Do you love me? Yes? Then feed my lambs, shepherd my flock. Let's go, let's move forward. I have more for you." That's his disposition. Here's one for you, kind of profound. I think we need to focus more on Jesus and less on our problems. I do. And that's not to say that we should ignore our problems. By all means, don't ignore your problems. You ignore your problems are going to get worse. But often I think that the problem isn't that we ignore our problems. That's not the problem. The problem is that we fixate on our problems and ignore Jesus and the solutions that he brings to our problems, right? Like, oh, I'm just an Enneagram 4. I'm probably always destined to be a little bit depressed. Or, oh, I'm just an introvert. I'll probably never love being around people, right? I'm both of those things. So if I'm picking on anybody in the room, it's me. But seriously, I think that we often view negative events of our past, or we perceive that there are limiting parts of our personality, and there are things that we maybe did or things that were done to us that we have now allowed to have authority over us and to define us. And so we live with some level of present brokenness, and we can trace it back to something, but we choose to be defined by those things rather than allowing Jesus to redefine those things and live more fully into who we're called to be, right? An example of this, I'm really grateful for the recent push in the last few years towards the destigmatization of mental illness. I have struggled on and off over the years with varying levels of anxiety and depression, and so the normalization of conversations around mental health have been really helpful for me. I'm grateful for that. However, one of the unintended consequences, I think, of the cultural push to destigmatize conversations around mental health is that sometimes we forget that we're not meant to stay stuck in it, right? And that isn't to say that everybody's going to get to the other side of it, right? Sometimes these things are really serious, and so I would never trivialize it because I've been through it, and it's really, really brutal. But it's been my experience that often support ends up just being enabling rather than truly helpful, right? Like, it's okay that you feel this way. And that is something that everybody who's struggling with a mental health issue needs to hear, right? It's not you're not weird. There's not something like terribly wrong with you. It's okay that you feel this way. People need to hear that. But often that's the end, right? I've experienced this, right? Instead, our approach should be, it's okay that you feel this way, right? Also, there's a God whose grace is sufficient in your weakness and wants to help you find healing and wholeness on the other side of all of this, right? And that's not to say that all mental health issues are going to be resolved by reading more Bible verses or coming to more church services, right? That's not at all what I'm saying. Sometimes it's going to involve counseling. Sometimes it's going to involve medication. Sometimes it's going to involve changes of environment. And these are all extensions of God's grace that he gives us to help us to heal from our mental health issues, right? But I think that far too easily we permit ourselves to fixate on our brokenness and just accept it for what it is and settle like, oh, this is just who I am, ignoring the fact that there is actually a God who wants to help us to flourish, not simply just barely survive the human experience, right? But it requires a readjustment of our focus. We need to focus more on who Jesus is and more on what he has done and more on what that says about who we are and much less on our problems that we can use to so easily define us and limit us and ultimately, if we're not careful, destroy us, right? We need to allow Jesus to deal with those things because we weren't designed to be able to. When my wife and I were looking to buy our house several years ago, we wanted to buy somewhere up here in North Everett. And so we looked at a lot of houses up here, and one of the things with all of these houses up here is that they're very, very old. And one of the things with very old houses is that they tend to have a lot of problems. And one of the problems that a lot of houses up in this area tend to have, especially because the ground is so soft, is foundation issues, right? And so if you're at all familiar with the sorts of issues that a faulty foundation can cause, right, it can be kind of problematic. Things like internal doors that won't shut, windows that won't open, floors that are sloped or wavy, right? Internal walls that are cracked, roofs that start to sag. And many of these issues over time can get a whole lot worse and make your house increasingly less functional. And if not properly dealt with, over time can make your house entirely unlivable. And so often with these old houses that have these really serious foundation issues, a professional has to come out and has to assess the problem and has to do what needs to be done to fix it, whether it's something as simple as filling cracks or attaching brackets to the outside of the foundation, or something as serious as hydraulically raising the foundation up, right? It's really significant professional work that should be only reserved for the most serious experts, right? And it needs to be done if you want to continue to live in a safe and functional house. And so it goes for our discipleship. Right? Just like a house where the structural issues above are often a symptom of the foundational problems below, right? The structural issues of our discipleship today are often a symptom of the foundational problems of our past, right? Like in a house, if a foundation is cracked, you might not be able to open the windows. And if your spiritual foundation is cracked, there will be certain parts of your discipleship that just won't function properly. And the only way it's going to get better is by addressing the source rather than just trying to manage the symptom. And so like a house, right, it requires dealing with that foundational issue, and it's almost never a responsible DIY project, right? Never. And so I don't know what the foundational problem in your life might be, right? Maybe it's something that a parent said that was negative that you've allowed to define who you are. Maybe it's a lack of approval that you got growing up that has instructed you that you're just not worth being loved. Maybe it's that thing that you did that you can't bring yourself to tell anybody about because there's so much shame about it. Maybe it's just an accumulation of things over time that built up that caused you to believe that you were beyond the limitations of God's grace. Whatever it is, the reality is that some of us are so dominated by the sins and experiences of our past that it entirely dictates who we are in the present and will completely color our future if we do not deal with it, right? Some of us are building spiritual houses on faulty foundations, and there's no manner of cosmetic repair that we can do to the upstairs room that is actually going to address the underlying problem. Amen. But the good news is, Jesus wants to do something about it, right? And Jesus has the expertise to do something about it. And he wants to partner with all of us in our process of finding wholeness from the brokenness of our past that limits our ability to live as fully thriving and fully functional disciples in the world, right? So for some of you, that might mean seeing a counselor. I have seen many a counselor in my life, and there's no shame in that. Like, nothing but good can come from that. For some of you, it will mean finding restoration in Jesus in the context of trusted friends, trusted community. That's actually a really significant part of Peter's story here in John 21, right? Yes, it was important that Peter experienced the love and the forgiveness and the grace and the mercy of Jesus. And yes, it was significant that Peter had the opportunity to re-articulate his love for Jesus. But one of the keys to the story here is actually that the conversation happened in the presence of the other disciples. There's no indication that Jesus took Peter aside for this conversation. There's no indication that they took a long walk down the beach for this conversation. It appears that breakfast just ended, everybody's still sitting there around the fire, and Jesus just turns to Peter and starts asking him, do you love me? And everybody else is there auditing this whole situation, right? Peter was restored publicly in the context of community, in the context of people who knew about his past, who knew about the self-confidence that brought him to that point of failure, who knew about his failure, and who would be the ones to walk with him the rest of his life as he worked out his discipleship. That's crucial. We need that, right? That's a big deal. Finding restoration in Jesus in the context of trusted people is really, really, really important. Shameless plug here. If you're a dude in the room today, you should definitely come to the Summit Initiative training that we're having in a couple weeks. Like, no kidding. You should come. You should sign up today. If you're a wife in the room sitting next to your husband, like, just jab him in the side or sign him up for him. Because the training is designed to help men do, in a sense, exactly what Jesus helped Peter do in John 21. Right? It's designed to go back through your moments go back through moments in your story that damaged your discipleship and moments that bred shame into your story, moments that now adversely impact your ability to mature as a disciple of Jesus. And it helps you to find freedom from those past experiences that are holding you back and to live fully into the purpose of who God has called you to be. The founders of Summit Initiative actually originally designed the training for the military. And if you know anything about the military, you know that there are a lot of young men and women, but the training was designed originally for men, who are dealing with a lot of hurt. And the training was so effective that the military actually asked them to expand the training to be more broadly inclusive to people of other faiths. And the founders were like, we can't. It won't work, right? The key is Jesus. It's not just some universal therapeutic principles, right? There's only one healer, and his name is Jesus. Like, there's only one solution, and his name is Jesus. There's only one capable of bringing about the kind of radical life change necessary to shed the problems of our past and to live fully into our future, and his name is Jesus, right? And the military was like, okay, yeah, whatever whatever you're doing is working, keep doing your thing. That's amazing, right? Because Jesus. You should definitely come. I've heard incredible stories from people who have been a part of it. I think it's going to be one of those things where, dudes, if you miss it, you're going to wish you didn't. So May 15th, 8 to 4 p.m., sign up on the app today. Infomercial over. But it's so true, right? Finding restoration in Jesus from the foundational problems of your past means intentionally allowing Jesus to help you deal with them. And often with help and always in the context of community. Our passage for today concludes like this. Band, you guys can go ahead and come back up. Truly I tell you, when you were younger, you would tie your belt and walk wherever you wanted. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hand, and someone else will tie and carry you where you do not want to go. But he said this to indicate by what kind of death Peter would glorify God. After saying this, he told him, follow me. And so in saying this, Jesus is prophetically indicating the type of death that Peter will ultimately endure as the cost for his discipleship. And this is interesting because if you remember in John chapter 13, Peter self-righteously commits himself to Jesus and then declares that he would be willing to die for Jesus, right? But then we all know that the great irony of the story is that he fails to do that, right? He says that he's willing to die for Jesus, but when his life is actually on the line, everything crumbles. But here in John 21, all of that gets inverted. It's crazy, right? So Peter is no longer proudly committing himself to Jesus. He's just humbly submitting himself to Jesus. And it's no longer, I love you more than everybody else. It's I love you, you know my heart, Lord, and that's all I have to give, right? And it's no longer Peter boasting in his willingness to die for Jesus. It's actually now Jesus who's declaring that Peter will die, right? And it's a prediction that would loom over Peter's head for the better part of the next 3 decades until he was indeed finally martyred. What a story of heart change. Peter went from boasting in himself to boasting in Jesus, from failing to follow through on his commitment to stick with Jesus no matter what, to spending 30 some odd years following through on what Jesus said he would do all the way to his crucified end. And how did he get there? He allowed Jesus to take him back to his point of failure. And in that, Peter squared with the reality of his brokenness. He squared with the reality of his need for his reliance upon Jesus. And then he humbly resubmitted himself to Jesus and publicly reaffirmed his commitment to Jesus. And in that, the limitations on his discipleship were gone. The burden of shame that would have weighed on him for life was gone. And he spent the next 30 years fully living into who he was created to be, fully living up to his identity, fully living into his destiny, living out the calling upon his life that Jesus had put on him. Friends, Jesus, through the power of the gospel, wants to do the same for you. He wants to take you back through experiences that you've had that have put limitations on your discipleship, experiences that maybe have bred shame into your discipleship, experiences that are stunting your ability to mature as a disciple, and to ask you that ultimate question, do you love me? And to give you the opportunity to reply with all the humility in the world, yes, Lord, you know my heart. You know that I do. You know that I love you, and that's all that I have to give. To which he'll graciously respond, I know you do. So let's go. Let's move forward. Embrace all that I have for you, right? Because it's better than you could ever imagine.